Hello, this video will be the first of a series focusing on Winnipeg and the Hermetic Code, but we'll also be looking at other cities in Canada and the US, for instance Edmonton, Toronto in Canada, as well as Chicago and Denver and the state of Michigan and a few other places, to show that it's not just this will be a follow-on from a series I just did on New York. So to show how this is repeated across the Americas and how it's built around state capitals, especially major public buildings, not cherry-picked random buildings, but very important historical building that were there from the start, basically creating the framework of a city. And just by following the same trail, the same methods, you will see that the pattern continues onward. Now, the previous video I did was in regards to the International Peace Gardens on the border of North Dakota and the province of Manitoba. Winnipeg is the capital city of Manitoba, and it's very important in regards to the code. So I'll try to remember to put the link in regards to the International Peace Gardens, because even this same pattern, very strong esoteric links, for instance through Freemasons being the most obvious connection. But again, I have to remind you that it's not just them. This is part of an ancient pattern, but some of the main features and buildings. Well, firstly, this part I want to focus on astronomical connections, but one of the main buildings, and I'll put some links also in the description to Frank Albo, because he's done some work in regards to the Manitoba Legislative Building here. And an interesting point is, astronomically speaking, is that the cornerstone, and this is especially in Masonic ceremonies, the laying of the cornerstone is a very important ceremony, and on that particular day, Venus, Mercury and Venus were basically aligned in the northern sky. That was on June 3rd, 1914. The northern cornerstone and Venus and Mercury, the planets, were aligned on that day. Mercury or Hermes, as in the Hermetic Code, or Venus as in Aphrodite, Venus to the Romans, Aphrodite to the Greeks. But as with so many other points, there's multiple levels. So going back in alchemical charts, and still basically today, the symbols for Venus and Mercury also connect to the elements of copper, and Mercury the element, as in Mercury the god, or Mercury the planet. And even the word mercurial still persists as this, something that's mysterious, has deeper meanings. So another important site in Winnipeg will be the Leo Mole Sculpture Gallery. So it's, again, not just buildings, but even, for instance, in Sydney, and I'll do the connections. I sort of covered it in an early video, but this is Leo Mole himself, and how these parks, which Parklands is, through some private discussions I've had, but it's even not too much of a secret, for Masons, Oddfellows, Theosophists, Parklands are very important sites, and the creation and design of them is also very important. But so Leo Mole Sculpture Garden very much connects to, I've done a whole bunch of videos in regards to Sydney and the Royal Botanical Gardens and Hyde Park, the way they connect. The symbolism is paper thin. It's just a matter of reading it. And so if you just show the repetition of it through many cities, especially in the Western world, because of immediate connection to Freemasons, but it's a broader sense. Freemasons are involved in the Hermetic Code, but it's not exclusive to them. It goes back thousands of years. Some other important sites and connections, for instance, the library building there has a sculpture, Emptyful, which is this flask. So on the surface of it, there's an alchemical connection or a chemistry connection, the way it depicts this flask, but also it's 36 feet high, and this is another standard. So for instance, She Guardian in London, so many in Sydney, basically across the world, this weights and measures are one of the key points to this. In a random world they would be 39 or 38, but no, they choose 36 repeatedly. Or 36, 72, 144. These are the Pythagorean harmonic numbers, and they're very important. Now, another very important historical site in regards to Winnipeg is the Fort Garry Hotel, and I'll examine that again further as we move through the series, because this is another a key point, and again, it's imbued with the Hermetic Code, both in symbolism, but especially in the very tangible. You cannot deny the weights and measures systems, and this will carry through all of these buildings. Has it carried through with New York, Sydney, and so many other sites? As again, we'll try and this will be focused on Winnipeg, but we'll be dropping into Chicago and many other capital cities, both in Canada and in the US. So we have now the Forks Park in Winnipeg, and this we're focusing now on one of the structures there. It's a sculpture, but it's also very strong astronomical connection, and this sculpture is called the Path Through Time. And again, it has multiple symbolic links, but also the way it's been aligned to the movement of the sun. Therefore, in an astronomical connection, it's not just some random sculpture dropped. Some calculation, some energy has gone into creating this. Now, there are many other factors about it that connect to other parts, but for instance, this is from Google Earth view. And we'll get a little bit of a better view. Sorry, my connection's really slow, so I don't always get the best description, but we'll have a look close. Now, here's another example of it. Now, these symbols on it's probably hard to focus in on here now, but there we have a better view, where it's basically the evolution of scientific instruments from the earliest stone tools up to the most modern of tools. And so here are some pictures of it. So we have this granite half circle there, and that's as the sun shines through these the cutouts, they basically tell the story of the growth of science. So the path of time, and so here we see the plaque. The path of time celebrates a procession of history at the Forks that contributes to the present. The tools used to shape the prairie, stone axes, scythes, locomotives, steam engines, steam tractors, computers, are reflected in each turn on the limestone centerpiece as the sun crosses the sky. The upper row of images is illuminated by the summer sun, the lower by the spring and autumn sun. So again, there's this astronomical connection and hidden in plain sight. Scott Onstott's series, Secrets in Plain Sight, you probably best off watching this, because this is now he's mentioned Winnipeg and other parts, but we'll look in more detail in this particular episode. But also in the Forks, we have the Oodena Celebration Circle. Now, those metal structures, armatures, are very important, and the stones upon which they are based are very important and have symbolic as well as astronomical connections once more. And so this will be another reference, and we'll go through the rest of this episode will be a focus on this particular stone circle. Now, the site itself was built on an ancient meeting site, because it's at the meeting of two rivers, thus the Forks, where the forks of the rivers, which was traditionally a meeting point. Now, for instance, the site chosen for Washington D.C. follows a site where these where the rivers come together. It's a natural choke point, let's call it, for trade and for people meeting, and you'll find this carrying through, because Washington essentially will follow the same pattern. Well, it does follow the same pattern, but so the Oodena, sorry, I should have checked the pronunciation first. I'll just be calling it the Oodena Celebration Circle. It's an ancient site, meeting place for the First Nations peoples of Canada, and there are many interesting connections. So I'll try to remember. For instance, the sun wheel in Alberta is at least as older than Stonehenge and the pyramids, and it is aligned to the cardinal points of a compass as well as key points such as the equinox. And the Oodena circle here has the same thing going on, but it's a modern version of it. So there's been a lot of things added to it, but it's also cross cultures. So it's basically a celebration not just of the first peoples of Canada, but also of many cultures across the world. For instance, as we'll look, the Sunstone of the Aztecs, Chinese mythology, African mythology, eastern and western and all parts of the world. And for instance, that's one of the main themes there is this Aztec Sunstone, and so that's the close-up. But okay, for instance, this is the original design concept, the map for it. So you can, again, with all these videos, I go through it pretty brief, but at least as a jumping off point for further research, because just basically use these as search words, look through, and you'll find so much more. So here's the Oodena Circle. You can see how each of these points around there with this metal structure, the armature, connects to the equinox, the solstice, cardinal points, but also constellations now, and very important astronomical connections. Now, even just like the Manitoba Legislative Building, this circle was opened on a very important astronomical day, the equinox of 1997. And the structure itself is aligned to it now. So as we go around, we'll begin with the fissure. In Anishinaabe legend, the fissure, which we call the Big Dipper or Ursa Major, is a set of stars, a constellation which circles the North Star, the pole star, which is currently in the Little Dipper or the Little Bear. So we have Ursa Major, and the tail of Ursa Minor, the Small Bear, is the northern point of a compass. But the Big Dipper or the Big Bear, as it circles around the pole star, the North Star, we see it marks out the seasons in a nice way. And this is relevant, touched on in earlier videos. I've done a couple on them, and how important the swastika was pre-World War II, going back to the most ancient of times. And back to the Leah Mole Sculpture Gallery, more than a couple of his sculptures feature the bear and the cub, the little bear and the big bear, and these are these subtle astronomical links which are repeated in parks and gardens across the world. For instance, here in Sydney, Washington, and these other places. Again, secrets in plain sight. But this, for instance, before World War II and the Nazi Party, the native people of North America, the swastika was a very strong theme, which was repeated across many tribes, and up till this present day, less now post World War II, but Masonic memorials, Masonic temples, the use of the swastika is a strong theme which carries through. And, well, we can't be sure, like, so much is lost in the mists of history, but this symbol seems to depict not only the seasons, but the North Star. It's a navigation tool, and that's one of the reasons why it's so powerful as a universal symbol, and why I believe that this interpretation of the swastika actually being an astronomical chart, seasons, and the constellations. Again, throughout this previous series, the theme of the Great Pyramid, and for instance, the Great Pyramid, the northern shafts track the movement of the North Star as it moves through as it circles around in procession. Another feature of the Oodena Circle we see it's related to in the Chinese mythology. We in the West will call it the constellation Lyra, but the Bridge of Birds, it's another theme of how the processional cycle of the key points of the zodiac are joined. But Lyra, the constellation, Vega, which the star Vega is part of the most bright star in the Lyra constellation, but Lyra, the Lyre, is also a very important symbol in Freemasonic traditions. For instance, this is Newcastle, the old Masonic Hall, Newcastle here in Australia. But what's interesting about this particular portion of the circle is also that the armature has an Aeolian harp, so it has these strings, the wind makes the harp sing. And I'll play as an example some Aeolian harp sounds, but Kircher, I've done some videos on him, Jesuit, early Egyptologist, Hermeticist, going back centuries. His books are very important, his works are very important, and amongst his many books, he was the first to describe, not to invent, but the first to describe the Aeolian harp. So that was an example of an Aeolian harp, but also Athanasius Kircher, very important Hermeticist, Jesuit, prolific in his works. And amongst them, well, Isis and the Sistrum. So again, this Isis link we'll see shortly. But also the musical modes, and Doric and Ionic are the important ones that I want to, because, well, we can be sure through the Salamis stone that Doric and Ionic systems of measurement, as in the ruler, go back at least 2,500 years. Now, the standard text will say that the musical modes were created, in the Enlightenment, Renaissance sort of period, Renaissance period around about there. But I would suggest that it's probably much older than that. And another example of how, for instance, Masonic tracing boards are based on ancient knowledge, which has been passed through. There was a rebirth through the reintroduction or the introduction of the Corpus Hermetica into Europe, for example. That's where we saw an explosion of knowledge of brilliant architecture and design. Another key feature on the Oodena Circle is the footsteps of Vishnu, which are connected to the constellation Aquila. Aquila, the eagle, you might note that it's also right next to Delphinus. This is a feature I've mentioned many times, connected to the story of Perseus, for instance, and the sculptures and systems, and we'll see another example of that, how it's here. But so the footsteps of Vishnu and his the way he defeated the demon king Bali. But Aquila, the eagle, is also one of the four horsemen or the four gospels or four evangelists, which is a standard throughout Christian symbols, but is also an important in regards to the processional cycle, which goes back at least to Aristarchus of Samos in the Greek period. And so the Gospel of John, and you see it even in older depictions, especially Jesus and the Vesica with the four figures around there. They are the four cardinal points of the compass of the zodiac: Leo, Aquarius, Taurus, and Aquila or Scorpio. And it's just a standard. I've done some videos in regards to this. It's but the precession or the great year, which is connected also to the movement of the pole star as it circles around, and for instance the eagle, the Gospel of John. Now each of these is also connected to an element. So we have the four ancient elements, but again, which are again another reference to alchemy. Another one of the features of the Oodena Circle is the depiction of Orion the hunter. Most people, well, Orion's belt. So it's one of those constellations that even if you don't know it, you've seen the belt of Orion. Even if you don't know it by name, you'd probably one of these things you'd recognise fairly easily. And so where we see some older illustration art of Orion, Orion's belt, and the sword which goes through his legs. Now, as it's been pointed out, no warrior puts his sword in front of his groin in that way. So the sword of Orion, no points for guessing what that really means. Also, for instance, Robert Bouval was the first to really highlight this, that the three Great Pyramids actually reflect Orion's belt. Now, this might be considered coincidence on its own, but there's another very strong connection to that. So we have the three pyramids of the Giza Plateau. The transparent one there is the Great Pyramid, and we see how it's positioned in relation to the Sphinx, which is orientated in a very important way. For instance, it would have been well, okay, that's a whole other saga. But so we have the three Great Pyramids, which reflect Orion. But another key point is that every 2,737 years, give or take, 273. This is a number, a beautiful, beautiful number. But the way that Mercury, Venus, and Saturn. Now, Saturn is lead, Venus is copper, Mercury is mercury, as we saw earlier, the legislative building there, and in New York and Sydney and all these other places, how especially Mercury and Venus, but even Saturnian symbolism is part of the Hermetic Code. And so we have a reflection of Orion on a very significant number of years. We have the three planets aligning to the southeast of the pyramids. If you project that down onto the pyramids, you get that diagram we just saw. But also the shafts of the pyramid I mentioned earlier. But so the northern shafts lead off. We're tracing the pole star as it moved through, or the North Star. But the southern shafts point off to, well, the zodiacs, which sort of basically run roughly across the equator, but they point to Orion, Alnitak in Orion's belt, and also points to Sirius. Now, the Trimble and Badawi established this going back to the 60s, but the armature, which is on the Orion portion of the Oodena Circle, that also cites Sirius. So we have Orion sighted, and we also have Sirius sighted. So again, the little bear we see, like now it's on the North Star is now moving towards the tail of the little bear, the pole star. But so that was the northern side. The shafts leading off from the southern portion of the pyramid lead to Alnitak in Orion's belt and Sirius, or the dog star. Both Orion and Sirius are universal navigation tools. Very, very, very important. Another portion of the Oodena Circle, we have the Sunstone. This time it's using the Aztec calendar depiction of that. Now the sun, of course, well, you know what it's a ABC 1, 2, 3 in regards to astronomical connections, but also it's worth noting that it also has alchemical connections. So the sun, the symbol for the sun is the symbol for gold. It's the color of the sun, actually the symbol for the sun is actually hydrogen in the modern method, but the sun symbolizes gold and the moon symbolizes silver, and we'll see that shortly. Also, so we have this depiction of Isis, and how Isis is the constellation we know as Virgo, the Virgin. Isis was the Virgin. No points for even a whole bunch of stuff there in regards to Isis, Osiris, and Horus. There's a picture of Isis with the sun god Horus, her child there. Osiris is the god of the underworld, but so as Isis was, she was being chased, and she was carrying a sheaf of wheat, and it scattered the grains of this wheat were scattered across the heavens, creating the Milky Way. The constellation Virgo, in one hand she holds the rod of power, in the other hand she holds a sheaf of wheat. Earlier, but these are also symbols of weights and measure. Again, I did a video in regards to weights and measures as symbols across multiple ancient cultures, and Virgo. So we use grains not only to make a ruler, so 3 grains will make an inch, etc., but also to create systems of weight as well. Now, royalty still holds the scepter and orb, which is, you'll find this also in ancient depictions, including going back to some of the earliest pictures of Ishtar, or the Code of Hammurabi. And the code was this old law system, also details weights and measures. Magna Carta does the same thing. There's the statue of Queen Victoria in front of the Manitoba Legislative Building. You'll see her, or similar statues, the scepter and orb, weights and measures. The ruler, as in the ruler with the ruler, and the orb as in the symbol of weight. And again, so I'll try to remember to link that video in there as well, because this is it's a blatant constant going across multiple cultures, including the Egyptian Book of the Dead, Babylonians, so many other Greeks, so many other cultures. Now, another feature in the Oodena Circle is the lion and the sickle. We'll begin with the lion, Leo the lion. Like literally, leonine features is described, someone who has lion-like features. But it is also important, not just for the constellation itself being part of the zodiac, it's also, again, connected to one of the 4 cardinal points of the zodiac, which is a symbol of procession or of a great year. We have the gospel of, the 4 evangelists. We have Mark, always depicted as a lion, still now in Christian symbolism. And And for instance, another example, so again, I'll just use the same graphic, the lion, which is so much connected to Jesus in the Vesica, and the four cardinal points of the zodiac around there. And so this is, the Oodena Circle is using a Mesopotamian, Babylonian depiction of it, but we'll see it, for instance, the Sphinx, again, or Christian symbols, so many other places, and just as an example of precession of the equinoxes. So on the equinox, the spring equinox, the sun will rise with a constellation in the background. So that's how we calculate the great year as these. Now that great year also connects to the movement of the North Star. But in Mesopotamian tradition, the bright stars on Leo's mane depicts the sickle. And this we'll see as we shift graphics. So that old, like the scythe, that old hand tool. So it's also a connection to the seasons, and especially the season of harvesting. So a harvesting tool, when they cut the wheat, they would have this hand tool, and that's one of the depictions for it. Now, earlier we mentioned the Aztec Sunstone, and now we have the goddess Oya, who is an African goddess connected to winds and storms, and again cycles of destruction and rejuvenation. So it's not just like with so many of these, the destructive goddesses, also symbols of rejuvenation. Like as the forest gets knocked down, it opens the sunlight for new growth, for example. So we have multiple cultures, multiple references, but how they all connect. It's an excellent example, this particular the celebration circle, of how these themes are constant. Now, a lovely other theme in regards to the moon, Oya, the African goddess, is also, she's connected with the moon by the light of the silvery moon. The symbol for the moon in alchemy is, the moon is silver. And but also an interesting point, like for instance, the 9 muses, Odin on the Yggdrasil for 9 days, the 9 noble virtues in the Norse people. Well, she was the mother of 9 children, and 9 being basically one of the key numbers in regards to weights and measures and the Hermetic Code. And again, we'll get into that in future episodes. So this is the just as an example, an introduction to Winnipeg. And so the previous series I did on New York, I had featured how the similar things, and we're going to find exactly the same systems of the Hermetic Code built into Winnipeg as is built into New York. And an interesting point, if you're into it, that the square which defines Washington DC, if you extend those lines out, they point directly at Winnipeg. And so again, if you're into that, that's a keep. Now, because there's a system of alignments, it's not just individual cities. There's a much greater plan behind this. It really is global. It really is ancient, and it's fascinating, but it's measurable, it's testable, and it's repeated. It's not. This is not about cherry picking. You can you find a Capitol building, look into the history. If there's any sort of Rosicrucian Masonic connection, you'll see that this blends into the Hermetic Code beautifully. So this is episode 1. We'll go into more and start examining, for instance, Manitoba Legislative Building and some other of these key buildings I've mentioned, and then linking them to sites such as Denver, Alberta, Toronto, and other places. But that'll be for the future episodes. And we'll have a look, because the connections are measurable, testable, they're there to be seen. It really is pathological denial to deny it, and it's beyond my comprehension how people at the very least couldn't find this interesting. The Hermetic Code, the 7 liberal arts, quasi-secret societies, because there's nothing really secret about. They are a society with secrets, but the Masons are not a secret society. They have big buildings and emblems emblazoned. They have an interesting history. They've done so much for the development of society. So again, it's the traditional stuff on the internet. It's basically bogus, and some of it's just outright lies, or at the very least, complete lack of research. I wouldn't even call it poor research. It's the complete lack of research for people who denounce these organisations so blatantly. It's a matter of not of my opinion. It's a matter of fact, because they do not discuss the the larger picture, the broader issues, or the recordable historical importance that they've had on the development of democracies and the constitutions around the world, and things like free speech and the free market and all these types of point. It used to be the kings and queens were absolute rulers. Well, who broke it? Who broke this system? That they didn't surrender this power. It was through organisations, in inverted commas, occult organisations were the ones who delivered us these freedoms in many ways. And so, okay, with that, hope you enjoyed this episode. There'll be more to come, and rather than just focus on Winnipeg, I'll also be connecting it to many other cities and provinces in Canada, as well as across the America as well. So anyway, hope you enjoyed and have a good one.